This is a silicon module right across from Breckenridge. It's on the other side. Notice it's all beat up and half buried in snow. This is the end of life. The question is, can technologies beat out silicon? And that's what this talk is going to be all about. So the question is, so new technologies, terrestrial or space? We didn't specify. So in the early 90s, from 1980, silicon was king in space. But since the early 90s, the only places where you're going to find silicon in space is on a space station and satellites that are disposable, meaning they're going to last about 3 days in space and then fall back to Earth. Resupply satellites very short term. But anything where you need real power or deep space probes, it's multiple junctions. So yes, consumer electronics, again, they beat out silicon. So right now, so the question really is for terrestrial power generation. And so I'll talk a little bit about the factors driving that efficiency, silicon versus the rest of the world, and cost factors. Again, this whole talk is going to be based upon this chart here, bankability and PV's challenge. Bankability, what does that mean? That means going to some financial institution and asking for $1 million. Why should they give it to you for your renewable energy product? You have to show, these guys are skeptical. They want to see everything. So performance, that's efficiency, that's power, that's energy. That also includes things like temperature coefficients, which means that at the same power rating, something with a lower temperature coefficient will produce more energy. Cost, how much does it cost? You can be really efficient, but if it costs too much, it's worthless. Or if the performance is zero, it doesn't matter how much it costs. Durability, it's got to last. You know, I mean, I've tested solar cells that spontaneously degrade about 50% in power per minute of exposure to air. That's some of the new, latest and greatest research cells. They can't stand air, they can't stand light. They're not very durable. They're never going to make it. So they have to make themselves more durable. They either have to design a more durable package. That's a job for the chemists. Or they have to basically try and package their way out of a durability problem. I'll tell you right now, packaging won't do it. All the studies show that if you've got a moisture problem in your renewable energy product, the cost of packaging to get it out is prohibitive. It's there, you can do it, but it's prohibitive to really hermetically seal it. Well, this is the chart that I've been famous for. I didn't produce every single point on this chart, but a bunch of them from 1980 to 2015 I did have. As you can see, I'm going to break this out because it's sort of a spaghetti chart. So let me go to the next one. This is really important. This is the global average power in terms of dollars per watt. In '76, it was up here almost $100 a watt. Now look at where it is. It's below $1 a watt. This is the dollar a watt here. And this is for the silicon modules cost. And so there's reasons why all these dips and ups and downs in the curves are. This curve is awesome in terms of how much the price has gone down compared to how much cumulative shipments. It's awesome in that there's no other technology that really beats it. Again, this cost, durability, and performance curve, silicon degradation rate is low. This is your benchmark. You got to beat this. If you're going to beat out silicon in the terrestrial market, you've got to beat this 0.4% per year degradation rate. This is from a site that was in a Mediterranean climate for almost 50 years. This data is pretty consistent. It's 0.4% to 1% per degree centigrade. Okay, if you want to talk about the differences in those numbers, you get to have discussions with mathematicians. There's about a half a dozen ways to identify field performance versus time and to eke out a 0.4% per year degradation rate when your noise is about 1% or 2%. And so you've got this curve with a lot of noise in it. You're trying to eke out a degradation curve. And so there's lots of ways to do it. I'm not going to talk about that. The point is, silicon degradation rate is low. If you want to beat out silicon in the terrestrial market, you've got to be at least this stable. If you're not, good luck in trying to displace silicon. Again, that bankability. Why should they invest money when silicon has a proven track record of 25 years in the field or more. There's been silicon that's been out there for over 50 years deployed. It's still working. I've got a silicon solar cell from Bell Labs. It was I tested at NREL for the 75th anniversary of the solar cell, and it was still as good as it was. Silicon doesn't degrade inherently. It's simple. It's got one element, silicon. Everything else is impurities, and they're relatively easy to manage compared to thin films. The performance, 15 to 25%. 15% is multi-crystal, 25% is the single crystal. This is state of the art. You can always make it cheaper. Again, in the 1960s, you can make a silicon solar cell in your oven. From Bell Labs, they sold a little kit, and you put this paste on, baked it, put another paste on, baked it, attached some wires, and you had a solar cell. It's easy to make solar cells. The question is, can you do it for efficiency and durability and everything else? So this is just, again, there's lots of silicon deployed everywhere. It's over 90% of the market. It's been over 90% of the market. Thin films, I say 1% to 15%. The lower end is a little bit questionable. And the reason why is for consumer electronics, these little solar cells you see in solar power calculators and everything, they're well below 1% efficient if you actually take them out and test them the same way you test a regular cell. But you don't care, they've got to work, and that's all you care about for your calculator. Okay, you don't really want to have to hold it up to light your calculator, but they have to work. And so the performance isn't, there's a range. There's a new material system out to just beat out this number by far. That's the Perovskites, and I'll talk about that. That's at the 20% number. But I didn't count them for this chart because they're less than 5 years old. So thin films are cheap. They're cheap. In fact, they're so cheap because their performances are low, they've got to make them for the price of glass. Meaning, if you look at a thin film module, the total cost of the module is the price of the glass and the package, and the little semiconductor PV material is almost nothing. It's like a few percent of the total cost. So yeah, it's cheap. But the other problem with thin films is it's all custom. There's no industry. There's no industry for CAD Telluride or CIGS or all these other thin film technologies. Amorphous silicon, there is a bit because of the flat plate display technology, this display technology. Even organic photovoltaics is display technology. So there is some secondary markets for these, but basically it's custom manufacturing equipment for thin films. There's not a big base. The only base you have is screen printing technology. There's a big base for that, but not really for photovoltaics. Silicon's got the entire semiconductor industry. They can buy off-the-shelf equipment. They just have to decide what size of solar cells they want. So they have very little custom equipment. Durability. Amorphous silicon's got a long track record, 40 years in the field. It's stable. Okay, it degrades 20%, it degrades in light, it degrades in moisture, but we know that after exposure to light, it degrades about 20% and stays there. And so it has an initial drop, and then it goes up and down a little bit with season. It gets better in the summer when it gets cooked a bit, and annealed is the term, or it gets worse in the winter when the light is on there and it's cold. But basically, and CAD Telluride is where most of the 5 or 10% of the global thin film market, it's all CAD Telluride, and it's all one company, and it's first solar out of the United States. Why? And it's all utility scale. Meaning they don't want commercial or residential people to have their product because it's a little bit, durability is in question, so they want to control it. They want to control their product, they want to control their failures. They want to understand them, and they don't want anybody else to know about it. And it's kind of an interesting business model, but it's working for them. They're the only ones that are competing against silicon on the terrestrial market. But again, the thin films, all of them, they're more sensitive than silicon to moisture and to corrosion and degradation. That's a problem. It's too bad, but it's real. So these are some examples of thin film solar cells, each one of these slides. Notice the fuzzy edges, little blob of solder here. This is one cell. Here's another cell. You got little wires coming off of it. Big challenge is what's the solar cell and what's not. What am I looking at here? That's another thin film cell. These are all thin film cells. That's fine, but to do something to make a real product, you got to make a module. So the first hurdle for any new technology is, can you make a module?
Okay, so there's two ways you can do amorphous silicon. One, you can do it on stainless steel, nice and flexible. United Solar has a really nice product, except they went out of business. And so here's their roofing product that they have. This is some CIS, and this is, again, some United Solar on Mount Evans. So amorphous silicon is really well understood. It's the only other material system besides the crystalline material systems that are understood, meaning the physics behind amorphous silicon that I had in school in 1980 still works today. And the physics behind why thin films work is no more understood today than it was in 1980. And you can't get a consensus. So that's a real challenge for thin films, is they don't know why it works. Meaning if you apply your single crystal silicon theory to it, thin film should not work. Amorphous silicon is different for a different reason, and that's got to do with the fact that there's an insulator here. So it's a P-type and an insulator, and then another N-type material. So it's a little bit different, but it's, again, cad telluride. This is CIGS, where the light comes through. It's got a glass or substrate metal. It turns out molybdenum is about the only metal they can find. Molybdenum doesn't stick where it beams to the substrate, and so that's a problem for thin film modules. That's in fact why Shell Solar and companies spent millions and millions of dollars trying to go into high volume manufacturers and failed because they couldn't get the yields up. They could make the modules, they were efficient, but the yield, the fact that they couldn't get the yields up killed their cost. Meaning they had to make these things for almost, for very small profit margins, so when they have poor yields, it's gone. And so they couldn't do it with high yields. Cad telluride, light goes through the glass, it goes through a TCO, which is typically tin oxide, and then cad telluride is the absorbent, then a metal on the back. That metal's a black art for cad telluride. It's got things like gold would be the preferred metal, but it goes right through the cad telluride and it's gone after a day. So it's got zero durability. Carbon is what they use now, but it's kind of like a paste, and they're not quite, and then they have to add chlorine in there. Chlorine, which is, they don't quite know why, but it doesn't work if you don't add it. And then you've got to have another piece of glass here to keep the whole thing from seeing any moisture, because this will degrade spontaneously in the presence of moisture. And so they've got to really seal it up. Golden Photon, which was in the business of cad telluride for a few years, actually put little desiccant between the two pieces of glass to try and keep the moisture out. And it turned out the desiccants blew the glass apart. And so it didn't work. And so what you have to do here is to basically have the glass edge seal sealed up really well. Again, you can't seal it perfectly. So how good is good enough? Well, that's what First Solar has been engineering. Dye sensitized. These are like organic dyes, you know, the things, you know, pink or red or yellow, pick your color. That's the problem. The fact I said pick your color. That means they all absorb light in the visible spectrum, and they don't use enough of the solar spectrum. So even if they're operating as good as they possibly can operate, they're not going to be any better than amorphous silicon, which also operates only in the visible part of the solar spectrum. So it's great if you want any applications where you want to have transparent photovoltaics, and you can look through it. Pick your color. Any color in the rainbow you want, you can make with these technologies. But again, if your goal is power and efficiency, this is topped out at about 10%. And they are really sensitive to moisture. And so they literally have to seal it up with epoxy that is ultra high vacuum edge seal. So any moisture that gets into these dye cells kills them. And again, that's why they haven't gone into large scale commercial production. But there's a consortium, there's multiple manufacturers trying as hard as they can. You can make this in any chemistry lab in college. This is an easy solar cell to make. And that's part of why it's so popular, is anybody in any organic chemistry lab can make it. Organic PV, that's the next extension from the dye. Good, let's go for more. You can have various, this is carbon-60 fullerenes. These are various organic dyes. This is a molybdenum trioxide. That's a transparent conductor. And again, there's a whole variety of organic molecules you can use, both solid state and liquid. But they all absorb basically in the visible, maybe the near infrared. Silicon goes out to 1 micron. The furthest out any of these go is about 800 or 900 nanometers. And that's a showstopper. It means they're not going to be as efficient. They're throwing away too much of the solar spectrum. Now this material is really interesting. It's been around for a while, like a couple hundred years, but it's only been about 5 years since it was, looks like my slide got chopped here. But basically this is this is one of them. It's particularly a crystal structure, the perovskite. And so there's a lot of different ones. The key is there's iodine, tin, lead, cesium. If you use the word lead or iodine in a semiconductor manufacturer, they will go nuts. That is like some of the worst things you can have around a semiconductor. Iodine goes everywhere. Lead is a fast mover. And so these things are interesting, and they're a little bit, and so up until very recently, they were very unstable. A variety of these molecules, in fact, will burn on contact with air. If you actually put this thing in the air, they'll burn. They are really unstable. Okay, the ones for solar cells, they're trying to make them stable. These guys are working as hard as they can. There's hundreds and hundreds of people in the US and multiple places all over the world working on this material system. Why? Because right out of the box, it was more efficient than any thin film before it, meaning within the first year of this material system coming out, they had independently measured efficiencies in the 20% range. Okay, that was really good. I mean, no thin film, the only thin films after 10 or 15 years of development were CIS and Cat-Terry that came anywhere near those numbers. So the only problem was that they were unstable. Oh, and a small measurement problem. They have incredible hysteresis loops. What does this mean? This means that if you change the voltage, the light level, the temperature, or anything, it may take a couple minutes to stabilize again. Okay, well, if it's degrading spontaneously and it's that unstable, it's very hard to test. In fact, custom software had to be developed. We had to go and sit there at the maximum power point and watch it stabilize. And so the bottom line is these things are like a little bit like batteries in terms of really slow response time. And they're unstable, but they're getting better. This graph is supposed to show efficiency. This is 100%, that's 0, and it's dropping about 20% after about 3,000 hours. Well, that's fine, that's 3,000 hours, but that's not enough for being outside for 25 years, let alone, so that's 3,000 hours on the bench in the lab with their own custom cells that they did at once. Okay.
These don't do well in air, but would they do well in the Martian atmosphere that's 96% carbon dioxide? What is it about it? I'm thinking.
Oh, that's interesting. That gets into the whole issue of thin films in space. The space guys, they've got an interesting saying. Thin films have lower radiation damage. They're more stable against radiation damage because they're already damaged. They're not very good to begin with. And so the space guys want to know how much power I'm going to get at the end of the life. That technology may do it, but the space guys are incredibly conservative. And so they're not putting anything up for any satellite that means anything until somebody puts this material in space on a demonstration satellite where it doesn't have to work. Meaning they just put it up, they test it or not, and then they bring it back down to the Earth, and if it survived, it's good. Most thin films haven't passed that test, by the way. Because of the thermal cycling, that tends to rip packages apart, minus 40 degrees C, plus 90 degrees C, every 90 minutes, you know, and things like that are really rough. Plasmonic structures, by the way, are quantum. Put the word quantum dots or quantum this or quantum that in there. They're quantum structures. So there's a lot of ones. I like the array concept. Think of a bunch of little antennas out there. Okay, and an antenna, if it's half the wavelength of light, and you have an array of them, should be able to take the light energy from the sun and convert it into electricity. It works. The only problem is the frequency that you're talking about is like 10 to the 17th hertz, or something like that, and then to try and convert that to DC, there's no technology out there that can really do that efficiently. And that's part of the problem. With all these things, they're theoretically very efficient, but they have issues with all kinds of stuff. They're unstable, but that's the kind of thing that it may be worth looking at. Somebody may be able to figure out a way to make these things stable. Large area, low cost. Again, large area, low cost. You got to beat out silicon. You can't just make a little square one once. You got to be able to make reams of this stuff all the time with high reliability. And so again, I'm not going to go into all these different structures, but there's a lot of them out there, and they almost all use the word quantum in there somewhere. And they're nanometer type scale devices, really small. Let's see here. Get this thing to go. So, one of the other issues that, it's not just PV, thin films. The whole market's got this issue. There are absolutely no standards for packaging. And so you've got glass, small, large. The biggest one's about 5.7 square meters, literally 5.7 square. If you can imagine that. It basically takes about, in fact, the entire back of here. You got metal, you got foils, you got all different kinds of shapes and sizes. That causes issues. Why? Because it's installation costs. It costs money to install. So again, this is one of the uses for thin films. This is on top of Mount Evans here in Colorado. The Amorphous Silicon powers the infrared telescope up there. And so this thin film does just fine up there. In fact, there's some advantages for this particular technology, especially around where people can go. Meaning you can go drive your car right next to here and go through a rock at this. But it's on metal foil. So if you throw a rock at this, all you'll do is dent it. And while in other photovoltaic panels I've seen where the public has access to it, you can throw a rock at it and somebody will throw a rock at it and the glass is broken. And it's tempered glass and you break it in one spot and the whole thing shatters. So thin films can put them on flexible substrates to make them impervious to damage by rocks, bottles of beer, or whatever else you want to throw at it. Crystalline multi-junction. This is essentially the high end of the business. Forget about the cost. What is the most efficient solar cell I can make using all the knowledge I know on how to make it? And that's where this realm goes. So the performance is very high, the cost is high. And I have a question mark here because the cost is depending. And for terrestrial, it would be for the concentrating photovoltaic market. And part of the problem with that concentrating photovoltaic market is the bankability. They couldn't convince the banks how much it cost and how much their system would produce. They had all this data in the lab, but they didn't have the field experience. And so that basically killed this market. They're still around, but the bottom's fallen out. Almost all the manufacturers have gone bankrupt. But the high-end business is still there because the space guys want it. They want it for their satellites. The degradation mechanisms are all fairly well understood. So again, we've got satellites. This is actually a concentrator. So this is a satellite that has lenses that concentrate the light onto little solar cells. And these are, again, these high efficiency multi-junction gallium indium phosphide, gallium arsenide. Some of them have gallium indium arsenide, some of them have gallium indium arsenide phosphide. Combinations of those metals. Again, here's some more of them. This is on a Mars rover. This is the Parker space probe. This is the one going around the sun. Here, the problem was thermal characteristics. How do you get something to operate in the coronosphere? You've got plenty of light. That's not the problem. And so thermal management was everything for these solar cells. They know how to do that, the technology. Okay, good. If you're not generating power with it, reflect it back as infrared. So, and then this is the Mars rover. This is a little overhead shot of the rover. And all these solar cells are gallium indium phosphide, gallium arsenide solar cells. In fact, this is the technology that NREL brought in more money on than any other patent in its entire history, is this gallium indium phosphide, gallium arsenide technology. NREL invented the gallium indium phosphide solar cell. They also invented the inverted metamorphic solar cell, which is the absolute highest efficiency solar cells, and the ones that everybody wants to put on their satellites because they are only a few micrometers thick. And because they're so thin, they don't have much material to get radiation damage. And so it has very low radiation damage. Again, concentrators, we have a concentrating system out in Alamosa. The cell cost is a small part of the total system cost. The economics, the trackers, and the maintenance. It's a utility scale technology because of these massive trackers that are required. And you need to keep them going because if this tracker goes down, you lose the entire thing that's mounted on it. It's zero. While with silicon, you drive out the DIA and you see that not all the trackers are pointing at the sun. Those trackers that aren't pointing at the sun are still collecting power. Well, because why? Because in Colorado, about 80% comes directly from the sun. Take the cosine of the angle between you and the sun and you figure out how much it's reduced. And then about 20% comes from the rest of the sky. So even if you're looking straight north, you'll get about 10 or 20% of the power. While for concentrators, it's zero. That scares people. The other thing about concentrators that scared the banks, and this had to do with durability issues, is, and Colorado's particularly, it's the worst in the country in this. It's the full power, no power, as clouds come and go. Right, and we get these dense, thin clouds that knock the sun down to zero, and then it comes back to full sun. Zero, full power. So you can imagine 10 megawatts, 0 megawatts, or 30 megawatts, 0 megawatts, 30, that happening like 10 times a minute. That's rough on power electronics. And again, there's tests to simulate that and make the solar cells safe against those kind of issues, but it's still brutal on them. Thermal shock and everything else. Again, this is the little itty bitty concentrator cell, 2.3 millimeters. That is so small. And every cell needs a little diode to keep it from getting fried. That's the other thing on these 3.5 solar cells and even most of the thin films. If you wave your hand over it, you can destroy it. Literally, if you take it under, if you short the sample, put it under sunlight and wave your hand over it, you can destroy them. And the reason why is they cannot see anything more than about a volt or two in negative direction. And so that's why every single concentrator cell needs a diode to protect it. For silicon, you can have about 20 silicon cells connected together and wave your hand over it. Okay, that silicon cell you shaded with your hand, maybe like 100 degrees C, if you touched it, it'd burn you, but it's not going to vaporize. Or die. These things will die on the order of microseconds. And so they have to be protected. Again, the technology's there, but it's just one more hurdle that the thin films have to deal with. Or something like this. This is a dense array of these. And so if you can think of these at the focal point of these dish systems, these solar dish systems, you can have an array of solar cells there. You see a power tower, you can put a solar cell there. With about 40% efficient. So they are actually, in some ways, cost competitive. The only issue is they don't have the field experience, so we haven't seen the failures, so we don't know all the various engineering things that have to be done to make it truly reliable. This is sort of what a typical high efficiency cell looks like. In fact, the highest ones that are 45% have about twice this many layers. The point here is not to look at all these layers and everything and say these layers are designed and engineered by a computer model, and each one is a certain thickness and of a certain type for a very specific reason. They are highly engineered. They are designed. Thin films are optimized by alchemy. That is a serious impediment to the thin film market on that cost, durability, and performance. Meaning if you've got to optimize by alchemy versus meaning trial and error, I did this, it got better, I did this, it got worse, versus I designed this and it got better. I made this change in my design, it got even better. And that's where the high efficiency end is. They're all designed by computer models. So this is even some more. I said the inverted metamorphic, that's this one. They realize that, hey, on these high efficiency stuff, if I grow the most important layer, the one that generates the most power first, I'll get more power. It'll be better. Why have I done that before? Because it means you have to throw away what you grew it on. You grow it on a wafer, you gotta remove the wafer. So you grow this film, and you gotta etch away the entire wafer and leave your little film left. And that's what that is. But that's the highest efficiency technologies are that. And they're very radiation resistant. So again, they're very complicated structures, they're engineered, and they're getting better. But they're getting better by computer modeling, not by any trial and error method. Meaning there are so many ways to screw up the efficiency on these things. You put a little scratch on that contact, you damage it. You do this, you do that. And so they have to, and even the edge, how do you isolate these things? How do you keep this edge from shorting out? All of those things are very important to this technology. So again, these are concentrator arrays. This is a linear array, point focus arrays. This is really small cells in a module. This was an idea that have it look like a flat plate silicon module, but actually be little concentrator cells for higher efficiency. It wasn't much better than silicon, and it cost a lot more. And that's part of the challenge of the concentrators. All right, so this is the efficiency part of it is, okay. The efficiency is typically done for your standard rating conditions is efficiency or power at standard conditions. That's not what you buy. You buy kilowatt hours. You buy, but the problem is kilowatt hours depend upon climate, season, and a variety of other factors. How you mount it, orientation, meaning you'll get 4 or 5% more kilowatt hours on a system that is a foot off of a roof than flush with a roof. That's not part of this, okay? That's system installation stuff. NOCT takes into account the fact that we rate at 25 degrees centigrade. For a module to operate with 1,000 watts per meter squared light on it at 25 degrees centigrade, the air temperature has got to be approximately -10 centigrade. So it's cold. It's got to be really cold and really sunny to get to be 25 centigrade. That's because the modules typically run about 30 or 40 degrees C above air temperature. And if you go 30 or 40 C times the number of suns, it's a little more accurate. Meaning if it's dark, it's 0, and at 1 sun, it's about 30 degrees. I say 30 to 40 because it depends a little bit on thermal characteristics. Yeah, you can, silicon, lowering the temperature coefficients will raise the energy. Right now, some PV has 1% per degree centigrade. You rate at 25 degrees centigrade, they get a big boost, meaning their performance looks good, but their energy's crap. Why? Because as soon as you get into any kind of warm climate or where it's mostly operating at, you're losing all your power because of that 1% per degree C. And again, we've been working for, decades. 1990 is about when they first started talking about energy rating. The theory's there. I mean, the measurement theory, the mathematical theory, the tools are all there. The problem is, internationally, there is no consensus on how to rate for energy. Utilities just measure kilowatt hours produced divided by kilowatt hours of light incident. That's reasonable. That's a local, here it is number. But it's not something you can compare among manufacturers or around the world. And again, the tools are there. PV watts is the most crude one. Just a second here. Yeah. PV watts is the most crude one, but there's a lot more sophisticated ones. This is silicon, performance versus time, 75-80. Okay, again, I got in the business right about here, 10, 15%. Looks like, okay, that's good. They've been at 25% now for almost 20 years. This is flat. And so silicon hasn't gotten, okay, say, well, why? That's because the theoretical efficiency is essentially that. They've squeaked about every amount of power out of a silicon solar cell that they can get. And what they've spent these last 30 years on is turning it in from a high-end integrated circuit looking structure to something that's screen printed and high volume mass produced and still almost as good. Something that uses a lot of aluminum and not much silver versus a lot of silver and no aluminum. Things that reduce the cost. Yeah, Martin.
Keith, could you quickly say how to read that chart? What's on the X and
what's
on the Y?
Yeah, this is cell efficiency, and this is date of measurement. And these numbers on this chart are independently measured by a recognized calibration lab. So it's not reported by the manufacturer or the researcher. It's something that was independently measured. And the reason why that's important is the differences could be off by a factor of 2 on some cases. And so if we did that, the graph would really have no meaning. The high efficiency right there, about 47%. They've been on a steady uphill trajectory over the years. They're still getting better. I'm pretty sure you're going to see 50% efficient solar cells under concentration in the next decade. The designs are there. It's just a matter of doing it, getting everything right. Again, you can see lots of different ways to make these high efficiency structures. Thin films, Cadterra, they're getting a little bit better. They started out 4 or 5%. Now they're in the 18% range. And so that's CIGS and Cadterra. Amorphous silicon, which is this green curve, is flat. That's because since about 1995, they haven't gotten any better. They've done everything they can do to think to make amorphous silicon better, multiple junctions, put some germanium in there to get the better IR response, and they're there. We had our recession, United Solar got their stimulus package, they still went bankrupt. They just couldn't compete with crystal silicon, it's that simple. What?
Which ones go on our house?
Yeah.
In that chart.
What?
Go back to the other slide.
Which lines are the ones they put on our houses?
Oh, well, almost everything on your house is silicon. In fact, and so the silicon would be the blue curve. This is the silicon.
Okay.
And so these are various groups that have made it, Sanyo, Sharp, research labs, the Germans, SolarX for the early multi-crystal silicon. Arco was the largest manufacturer at the time. University of New South Wales did all the physics tricks to make them better. But thin films, you might see some amorphous silicon on your house. There's a few amorphous silicon systems that are around. The Burdick Technologies, Joe Burdick, sold amorphous silicon systems for houses. This is another chart at the module level. Again, it shows blue is silicon. It's pretty flat. Modules haven't gotten much better since about 95 or 2000. They're just starting now to get to the 20% range. The thin film, again, amorphous silicon's been very flat. Emerging PV's gotten better, and the organics. So these guys have gotten a lot better. They're going up on the charts. The high efficiency stuff has gotten better, but there's not very many points. Why? Because nobody wants to compete in this market for the terrestrial. It's just, or if they do, they want to do it for large scale systems and not an individual module. I think I'll skip this. This is just showing that they're getting bigger as time goes on. And the organics are a lot smaller than the silicon. And again, this is again showing that the efficiency is going up for cadmium significantly over time. The areas are going up, you can see. And so this is basically what First Solar has done, what you can do with empirical optimization. Alchemy, you can actually do this. If you're and these guys are incredibly meticulous. They measure everything on their product. They measure each step of the way, so they can go back and say, oh, we had a bad week here. This is why. The humidity in the factory floor was too high, or this or that. And so they've got all kinds of quality control associated with this. But the bottom line is they don't understand why it works, the physics, and they're not quite sure on all the failure mechanisms. They know how to engineer around them, though. That's the important point. Amorphous silicon, again, it's the stabilized. This is the word stabilized. I would use that for other thin films, except most of them don't have a stabilized state. Meaning if you try and apply a stabilization criteria, they keep getting worse, and they never stabilize. Amorphous silicon stabilizes to about 20%. You can see it started out in 1980 at only a few percent. Now it's up around 10 or 15, and it's been there. And so that's where it is. Organic is, again, getting better, but it's not really getting much better than about 50%. The perovskites are getting better, and that's the hope. Boy, if you want anything that's going to beat out silicon, it's that material, except for one problem. It involves materials that are unstable, very unstable, not just a little bit unstable, very unstable. So you're going to put something out in the field that's unstable with no field history and claim it's going to last 25 years compared to silicon. That's going to take some proof. The biggest hurdle that we have is on the durability, and I'll get to that in a second. Cost. Levelized cost of energy is one way to look at it. There's a variety of metrics. It's a step going beyond efficiency or performance. It takes into account degradation and energy. And so it depends upon which site you pick. You want to pick a hot, humid site, a cold site, Seattle, Washington, whatever. But you can figure this out for any location. Again, the concentrators should be good, but the industry couldn't compete because they couldn't accurately predict their costs well enough to keep the banks happy, and it was utility scale. So again, this is part of that learning curve, US megawatt dollars versus time. Notice here, the levelized cost of energy has been going down with time. That's really good news. Notice this is grid parity. This is what the grid is, and this is what PV is doing. So PV is essentially at what's called grid parity. These are other countries, Germany and Japan. And you can see Germany's already crossed the curve on PV's cheaper than the grid, and Japan's essentially there too. So right now, silicon, because is at grid parity. This is important for anybody that wants to displace silicon. This is called the learning curve. It's got the capital cost and then the cumulative capacity, meaning the more you make, the cheaper you can make it. It's that simple. And so these are various technologies, ethanol, PV, solar, thermal, wind. Now these happen to be all renewable energy technologies. Notice nuclear has gotten more expensive with time. As they installed more, it got more expensive, not cheaper with higher capacity. But PV is definitely going down, and if you look at this compared to other industries, it's very rapid, meaning that curve is going down as fast as the semiconductor industry did, memory chips, any other industry you want to look at, the PV curve. So there's a variety of things that happened. We had a recession. Okay, that caused a dip. The Chinese dumped on the market. That was a problem. We had strong demand, so there was a silicon shortage. That meant the price went up. But bottom line, it's followed this curve. And that's good news. That's saying that if you do another factor of 10 increase in production, stay on this curve, it's going to go down even more, just because of standard industry learning curves. If you're the new kid on the block, you're up here with thin films. That's the problem. Anybody who wants to displace silicon gets to start this curve here. You have cumulative module shipments in the terms of megawatt peak. That's where CIS is, or CAD Telluride. Amorphous Silicon may be over here a bit in terms of the cumulative, but that's the challenge, is you're starting out at the high end of the learning curve. So you not only have to be better than silicon, you've got to be a lot cheaper, because you're at the start of the learning curve and they're at the end. And they're not going to say, well, I'll wait for you to catch up. No, this is cost competitive. You have to compete with silicon now. So one of the things that have been done on reducing this is basically, there's a variety of things you can do to reduce further cost reductions, but it's not going to be in the PV. It's really not. It turns out, and I think this is the next one, PV is no longer the dominant cost in a module or a system. PV system costs are much more than the module and the inverter. So that means no matter what you've got this percentage going into other stuff. It may be a little bit different for residential versus commercial versus utility, but it's something like that PV is. And so now you want to compete against silicon, which is sitting on the sweet spot of cost, performance, and durability. And you're operating with this amount. So you've got to convince them that your new product is going to make this stack even lower. And that's going to be a hard one, because you're only working on this part of it. And so they're very skeptical. Notice also the cost of energy is very sensitive to degradation rate. So this is module price, dollars a watt. Okay, so that's and this is the efficiency. Notice here at some efficiency, it just doesn't make sense, meaning the module cost can be 0, and it's still not economical. because the efficiency is below 10%. Whether it's 10 or 15 or 18, the bottom line is below some efficiency, the module can be given away for free, and it won't, and the system can't be competitive with silicon. So just saying I've got a cheap thin film isn't going to help. It's got to be above a certain performance. It's also got to be durable. This is 2% per degradation rate, right? Well, guess what? That's where thin films are sitting. Most of the thin films, the good ones, are sitting at 2%. That doesn't even tell you about the hot humid study where it's more like 50% degradation rate. Meaning if you put them in South Florida, your thin films, good luck. That's the bad news. The good news is they're not selling them to you because they know they'll fall apart in South Florida. And so, I mean, in fact, that's good. We've identified half a dozen sites in the United States to make sure products have to survive. And hot, humid, we found out, is the worst climate for thin films you can think of. It turns out Denver's got some interesting stresses, but it has to do with high UV and high wind and hail. PV's tested for 1-inch hail. They've got a 4-inch hail test. Thin films can beat out silicon, perhaps, for a hail test. But again, the market is such huge volume now. Having a little niche market, you might be able to compete against silicon. You know, I've got some specialty market like custom modules or custom colors or really harsh environments, like you can put it in the middle of a hailstorm and no problem. But, you know, for instance, the last hailstorm we had that took out Colorado Mills, I think NREL had, I think it was like 5,000 solar panels and 2 of them got damaged by the hail. And so that was more than 1-inch hail. Anyhow, degradation rates are everything. That's 2% per year, not per minute, per hour, or anything else. That's per year outdoors in the field. How can you predict 0.2% per year for 50 years? How can you guarantee that? You better understand all the ways they fail, and you better understand the physics behind it so you can model it, and then you can stress it. It's understood somewhat for silicon. We've got 40 years of stress tests and fuel experience. For thin film, we've got about 10 years or 20 years of stress test and fuel experience. It's not as much, but we do know certain tests are brutal on thin films, like hot humid, or the wet high pot, which is basically you put your product in a vat of liquid, and it's a safety test. And you take the plus minus terminals, and then you take the water and you put a couple thousand volts there, and the current has to be below some threshold, like microamps. It's a safety test. Basically, it's for if you touch a PV panel when it's wet, you don't die if it's not grounded. Okay, it's that simple. Thin films have trouble passing that, especially the ones that are flexible. The ones that are flexible almost can't pass it because if it's flexible, it means it's got plastic and moisture and flexible. Well, flexible plastics and polymers tend to be moisture sieves. And so it's really hard to protect from moisture and have a flexible material. Anyhow, those are the challenges. Durability. Again, they're warranting now for 25 years, then they're starting to offer 50-year warranties. Metal corrosion. That means, you know, just, again, South Florida on the Space Coast, right? You got salt water and everything else. They have tests for salt water, by the way, but whether they test your product to it or not is a separate issue. And so as a consumer, you get whatever your installer put on your roof. And you hope they put on stuff appropriate for your climate zone. And it needs to be verified, the durability in different climate zones. For instance, thin films do just fine here in Colorado. They love it. The CIS and the Qatari systems do just fine. They don't degrade. Well, those same modules, you put them in South Florida, and they're gone within a year. The other good news about all these failures is the semiconductor industry also studies failures. How, you know, wire attaches, corrosion, moisture ingress, all the various things. You've got the silicon industry in the back here. The shade-tolerant design is just something that's come out real new fairly recently. And that's basically when PV manufacturers say, I've got a shade-tolerant module. What they're doing is putting a bunch of diodes in there. And so when you shade something, instead of the entire power of the string going into that spot where you shaded it as a heat source. It just goes through a diode. So you still lose the power from the shading, but you don't lose the entire string. And so it helps a bit, assuming the diodes last longer than the PV. That's not quite clear that that's true, meaning we don't have enough field experience, and the stress tests for these diodes aren't really developed. So we're just assuming that all these diodes on these shade-tolerant PV module designs are going to last 25 years. Okay, we may find out in 5 or 10 years that they don't. I don't know. Those are one of those things you typically don't find. Just like on some thin films, I can think of degradation mechanisms for thin films, amorphous silicon, CIS, telluride, all these, where everything's fine. The efficiency's just fine, the performance, everything's good until it goes south. And then it goes south very quickly. You know, like within days it goes to 0. And that's basically because they're very thin and everything's, for instance, for amorphous silicon, everything's fine for any kind of impurities or stuff that gets into the amorphous silicon until it gets into the, goes about 100 angstroms in, past the top amorphous silicon layer, gets into the, what they call the intrinsic or pure silicon layer. And when it gets there, it's dead. It kills it. And so it goes from fine to dead. Thin films are like that also. They can get shorted. Silicon tends to degrade in a much more benign manner. It sort of just slowly wears out and gets bad. Wires get corroded or something. But while thin films tend to be much more complete failures. Again, this humidity freeze test is one of the, and this are the two most brutal thermal cycling tests. This is the one where you've got to be 85% humidity, 85 degrees C for 2,000 hours. And then afterwards, it's got to drop less than 5% of the power. Silicon can pass that with no trouble. In fact, they do it for like 10,000 hours for silicon. No problem. For thin films, a lot of it can't pass this first hurdle. The dye sensitized cells can't pass this one because the dye freezes, the electrolyte freezes. And minus 40 C, that's going to freeze any electrolyte, unless they use some alcohol-based electrolyte. But if it's electrolyte-based, that's going to freeze it. That means dye sensitized cells might be fine for indoor, but they're not going to be useful for outdoors. This test drives moisture into the package, and then it freezes it. So it's designed to rip the package apart. You know, with this, the high pot is that test where I again described where it's the insulation resistance between the frame and the wires. It's a safety test. You can design packages with like organic layers that make them very, very good moisture barriers, but they're expensive. You can put edge seals on there like rubber and various kinds of silicones. Those are also expensive, but you've got to have something there. And so how to seal them? Telluride managed to seal them with something pretty cheap. I showed this already, but the degradation rates, again, if hot climate's 0.7% per year, that would be like Phoenix. Hot, humid, it might be even a little bit higher. Moderate climate, that'd be like here. It's a lower degradation rate. They have different degradation rates for different climate zones. Miami, that's the green curve here. And notice it degrades more. And that's silicon. Why? Because it's hot and humid, just dries moisture in, it just corrodes stuff. This is a study of the literature from 370 different PV systems, looking at what is the degradation rate for silicon. And it's around, this is where the 1% per year comes from. Notice these numbers, they don't really like. You can forget about them, but if it's your system, that's a very real number, that it's falling apart. There's a lot of reasons why systems can do that. If it's not a shade-tolerant PV and you've got a big old hunk of tree shading on half your module every day, that means half of that module is going to act like a little heater, and it's going to cook, and you may overheat it. Whoops. Again, this is a 0.25% per year. This is in Mediterranean. This is the Mediterranean climate zone in Italy. This is the European solar test installations data on modules they've had out for over 20 years. And so they've studied all the different types of failures, visual inspection, cracks, delamination, all the various things. So they've got a variety of things that go wrong with modules, and they've indexed them. But the bottom line is this degradation rate is really, really low. That's one of the things I said too, how do you predict something's going to be durable? All we have is these qualification tests. This is the International Electrotechnical Commission Standard 61215. That's a standard test now for all, it used to be for silicon, now it's for silicon and thin films. This is the setup for silicon. The only difference between that and thin films is there's a stabilization test in here to deal with the fact that even silicon changes out of the box. Meaning, if you take a PV module from a manufacturer for silicon, you can easily drop 3 or 4% in power in the first day. You never see it because you're a consumer, but that's true. And there's physics on why it happens, and they can make it so it doesn't happen, but it costs too much. Thin films degrade for other reasons. The point is, what this initial stabilization is equivalent to is essentially hauling it outside for a month. You know, let it see about a month's worth of light, some temperature variation, and stabilize it, hopefully. Again, I say hopefully because some thin films will never stabilize. They'll go to zero with some of these stabilization criteria. That's not good. Obviously, that's still a research product. That's why they're not on the market. That's why you're not seeing them, is that they haven't passed it. So you notice here also there's not very many modules. So this is a scary number. This manufacturer could be selling a megawatt or 1 million modules, 10 million modules, based upon this test that only involved 8 modules. Meaning if they pass this test, they're home free. They get to say, I passed this test and go sell anywhere in the world. And that's scary because the manufacturer gets to choose those modules. They're supposed to be random, but God knows what random means. And so there's various ways they can improve upon it. But the manufacturers that want to cheat on this test did. The Chinese did that. They got slapped with tariffs because of it, among other reasons. But they were cheating on this test. And they got caught. And there's a variety of ways. But typically manufacturers, the good ones, the big ones, the reputable ones, want to pass this test in spades. They don't want to just barely pass it. They want to make sure that they can double these exposure times, double these cycles, and they'll still pass it. Why? Because they want to be sure their product's going to last 25 years. And again, when you're trying to design something that lasts 50 years, you want to make sure. And so these numbers of 1,000 hours of damp heat, that's like 25 years in the field, normal humidity conditions in terms of moisture. At least that's sort of the physics of it. So there are some technical reasons where that number came from. I say some because some of it's historical. Thermal cycles, again, that's designed to rip solder joints apart. That's cooking it and freezing it and see if things fall apart. So for durability, you got to do stress tests. You need field tests. And again, all of those things have to come together for PV. This is the CIS system. Again, this is another place where you're going to see PV is small demonstrations. Again, this is the Mount Evans telescope. You won't see this because this system gets put up when they close it for the winter, meaning they close the road for the winter and they take it down before they open it for the summer. And so you have to go up there when the road's closed. And so if you want to hike up there in the winter, you can see it. But anyhow, that's some additional power for the telescope. So that's basically my talk. And so do you have any questions?